Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. So yeah, I was just introducing that this work is very much an ongoing work. It's an ongoing research. It's not published yet. It's not even a draft yet. So I'll be very much looking forward to hearing from you. What do you think it works in terms of the questions that I'm raising, in terms of the material that I'm gathering through field work. And I appreciate to have discussion after the presentation. So I've been working since my PhD in this particular part of the Amazon. It's called the Tapajós River, which is this one right here. You can see it in purple. And of course, it's a region that has been intensely transformed during the last 2 decades by industrial agriculture and deforestation. It has become one of the main hubs of soy production in Brazil, and this whole intent of producing cheap protein inside the forest exported to distant countries, to the needs of distant continents such as Europe and Asia mainly. And one of the topics that I have been working on is the use of agrochemicals in forcing people to leave their lands. I call this process expulsion by suffocation. And I conceive it by talking with people mostly affected by glyphosate and by the use of agrochemicals in general, and their stories on the harm they experience, the choking, difficulties in breathing caused by the widespread use of agrochemicals. So it's literally a form of suffocation, of atmospheric contamination and respiratory asphyxiation, but it's also metaphorically a form of suffocation, because the conditions for their livelihoods to continue is stopped, it's harmed by the use of these agrochemicals. And there is a very intense process of urbanization correlated with a precarious urbanization related to these forms of agrochemical harm. As people are forced from their forested communities, they either go to they gather in small communities on the edges of the highways. So there's a sort of proto-urbanization process that arises from this expulsion from forested communities, but they also go to the outskirts of Amazonian cities. And you have a huge, in the last 20, 25 years, you have a huge growth in the peripheric, impoverished neighborhoods of Amazonian cities. And one must ask, what are these people doing once they go to these neighborhoods in a city? Because they're communities that have developed through centuries and through thousands of years an intense knowledge of the forest, an intense knowledge of how the environment works. So they are very well skilled to deal with agriculture inside these forest communities, with fishing, with hunting, with manufacturing life in these communities. But once they go to the city and they are forced to sell their labor, the work in the labor market, they find it very challenging. So that's one layer of precarity and urbanization that has been crossing along my work. And the other one is also the fact that the infrastructure is necessary for exporting grains to Asia and Europe are themselves transforming the landscape and the urban landscape and urban dynamics in the Tapajós. So they incentivize deforestation, connecting the region more tightly to a growing international demand for cheap grain-based protein. And of course, I have been working with these topics for years now, for almost a decade. And together with a colleague, Avner Prado, which is a photojournalist, and I must say that I have a background in investigative journalism that somehow overlaps and influences my work as a scholar in a meaningful way. Me and Avner, we have been thinking about this region called the Bananal Island, which is in another part of Brazil. It's in the transition between the Cerrado, which is a very biodiverse rich savanna in central Brazil and the Amazon. So this island, which is considered by some geographers as the biggest fluvial island on the planet, is particularly important because it's the transition zone between two of the most biodiverse biomes on the planet. So we might think, imagine life there in terms of abundance of resources provided by forests and rivers. And instead, what we find in the Banana Island is local communities increasingly facing drought, hunger, and disease. And so those are the three indigenous communities that focusing on this work, Boto Velho, Catangê, and Takayura. I will talk in more detail about that in a minute. So the main idea of this ongoing work is that there is a form of infrastructural urbanization happening in the Banana Island. And by that I mean dikes, canals, and irrigation systems extend the urban industrial forms of transformation into indigenous territories on and around the Banana Island. That is, by reorganizing hydrology, they reshape rivers, soils, food systems, and disease ecology in ways that fish population decline, plant fertility is weakened, and locally produced food is replaced by supermarket dependence, as well as we have an increase in stagnant water, creating the conditions for mosquito-borne diseases, usually associated with precarious urban neighborhoods in Brazilian and Latin American cities more broadly. So my argument, what I'm aiming to develop, I will go back to fieldwork in September. My main argument, my main idea is that these territories, they are neither forest villages nor cities, but hydrological borderlands of extended urbanization. There are spaces where agribusiness infrastructure produce overlapping vulnerabilities without providing the infrastructure of care, mobility, health, and education associated with urban citizenship. So in short, these communities, they are not becoming cities. It would be wrong to say that, but they're not forests any longer. What are they? In which forms is the extension of urban structures, infrastructures changing these communities? And these irrigation projects, they were designed to transform the region into a hub for intensive agriculture. And for indigenous communities, they brought deforestation, repeated displacement, and the disruption of river systems as grains farms expanding to forested areas, and dams and canals reshape the waters on which local life depend on. And this is the kind of huge infrastructural works being developed in the Banana Island. This particular one has absolutely no environmental assessment, no study on environmental impact it will be causing, and you can see this almost futuristic, huge pumps that are being used to bring water from this river to the irrigated monoculture fields. Does that make sense so far for you? Yeah? Okay. So now the second part will be talking more specifically about these three different indigenous communities and the way these hydrological infrastructures are transforming the communities through the last 4 decades right now. And this is a very interesting scene that we were able to witness, which is the Boto Velho village inside the Banana Island. The other two are around actually the Banana Island, but of course they compose the same ecosystem, the same hydrological system as well. And so it was the chief, the cacique, the indigenous chief, Wagner Javaé, returned from the market with huge watermelons on the back of his truck. He had to drive 60 kilometers each way, so 120 kilometers to get to buy food in the town of Lagoa da Confusão. And he explains that fish and cassava flour have traditionally been staples of the indigenous community's diet. But in recent years, especially during the extreme drought of 2023, fish have become increasingly scarce in the rivers. And what we can see here behind in the back of this image this cabin here is a ritual cabin in which the communities, mainly the adolescents, male adolescents, go in a ritual in which this straw-covered malacca built for the passage from adolescence to adulthood. So it's a very important moment in the lives of in the life of the community, and they no longer have the food they used to offer to continue the ritual. Now they are offering watermelon bought in the village and not manioc flour or fish. So what has been once sustained by land and rivers now had to be replaced by food bought in the supermarket. And of course, when we're talking about these communities, the kind of food they buy is very different from the kind of food that they used to cultivate in these villages. They buy much more ultra-processed food, and which means food rich in sodium and also food very rich in sugar. So this 30-day ritual based on exchange between communities and final relatives is now threatened by the growing difficulty of sustaining local food production. And they do not have the property, the tenure of the land in which they are currently living. So it makes it very hard for them to actually build house structures. So the houses are very precarious as well in this region. The transformations that they have been witnessing is so strong that what was once a river that would flood and make their land fertile in 2023, when we were working first in this region, became also an reduced river. So the river was reduced in such a drastic way that people could easily cross it from one side to the other. And you have to imagine that crossing this river, of course, is an aerial image from a helicopter, which makes it a bit hard to understand the dimensions, but it's pretty wide river and very dangerous to cross usually. The second village I want to talk to you about is the Takayura village outside of the island. It's in the surroundings of the island. And there we met the José Vildete Krau, who is the chief of the Takayura village, and he recounts the story of being evicted from the original territory in the 80s, and since then working in various farms across the region as a farmhand until 1996, when they engage in the struggle for their territory, which they have been evicted at least 3 times by now. So they constantly occupy this land called Mata Lagada, flooded forest, since the early 2000s. And after a certain period of time, they were evicted, and that same situation repeated itself at least 3 times. And Valdete, again, he mourns the days when hunting and fishing provided food for the communities, which is now unfeasible. They have only 8 hectares of land, about 20 acres, where they now reside, and they don't have the tenure of that land neither. So it's a very difficult situation. He says very different from the situation where he grew in, and because they lack territory. So also, he makes a very interesting comment as that the new dams and canals diverting rivers for industrial agriculture have reduced soil fertility because there is no more the flooding that would bring the nutrients necessary for the soil to get its fertility annually. If you think about the first civilizations, we might remember the situation, the accounts about that the ancient Egypt was only existed because the Nile could flood, and then, how do you see the opposite of flooding? Retract. Yeah. And that was what guaranteed the possibility of the Egyptian civilization. Is pretty much the same system here. Their cultivations every year depended on the flooding of the Javae and other local rivers, but since droughts and water has been diverted to this industrial agriculture sites. There is no more water, and they cannot fish because there's no more fish. It's impossible to have fish in this shallow water like this. They don't reproduce. They don't. They're not available enough. And I'll also call attention. So it's a very dire situation here because these houses that we see here, they are covered by these bags of seeds and fertilizers that are used by the communities to kind of avoid rain for getting site for impermeabilization, in a very precarious way of impermeabilizing their own houses. So in addition to living on a small plot of land that's not theirs, the Caota Caiorá are forced to relocate annually during the flooding season. And that's because when the river swells, the groundwater also rises. And the situation persists for months. So the point is that this hydrological infrastructure has completely disrupted the river flux that allow these communities to live in this territory for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the last example that I'd like to bring to you is about the Catangé village, also in Lagoa da Confusão, pretty close to the Banana Island. The same hydrological system. And there was a rupture in the communities. They split apart in two because some families, they were lured, they were convinced by an industrial agriculture farmer to start planting soy in the region. So you can see here, I think that I'm so lucky to have worked with a great photographer as Avner, who also did the field work. And here we have the amount of deforestation just a few meters away from where the village is located. So of course, the same impacts of pesticides that I've been working the Tapajós are actually also happening here in this part of this other part of Brazil. And so the indigenous families who opposed the soy farm project, they created the Catangé village in 2021. And if you remember, if you're a bit familiar with Brazilian politics, you probably remember the name Bolsonaro, which was our very far-right president. Perhaps by the time we were the country with the most far-right president on earth. And one of his, in day one, if you just remember like what Trump did in his first days, 2 times he got into office, he got out of the Paris climate change agreements, right? And the anti-indigenous policy was so important for Bolsonaro that was actually the first thing he did when he got into his office was to sign an administrative order to stop any demarcation of indigenous land territories in Brazil. And he built within the Ministry of Agriculture a group of people that would try to convince and would actually try to bring, to create scissions, to create divisions within indigenous communities and have them accepting industrial agriculture inside their territories. It's also important to mention that indigenous territories, although heavily impacted by deforestation, they are also strongholds of anti-deforestation efforts. They are places that have been deforested only 1% since 1986. That's the data, the longest data we have available for deforestation in Brazil, whereas the Amazon in general, considering all the different land statuses existing in the Amazon, have been deforested almost 16% since then. So we're talking about very different scales of deforestation, and that's strong consensus in the literature on environmental politics in Brazil is that indigenous community, the lands that are inhabited by indigenous communities are those that's deforested because people care for the land and they actively expel loggers. They ask for police and for the government to protect their land more actively, where in comparison to parks, with no population, parks that have emptied by this population, deforestation is much more advanced. So this situation here is prototypical of this kind of divisions created by the Bolsonaro years. And the access to the village is quite complicated because it's controlled by the farmers. You decide when people can go to the city for buying food, to visit a doctor, to go visit a son or a doctor who might be in the city for their studies. So indigenous groups started small-scale livestock farming and planting to sustain the family economy. But what happened is that during the very first Amazonian winter, which is the rainy season in the Amazon, all their land flooded. And then they built a ditch to try to, with the support of the state government, to contain the water. But what ended up happening was very different from what was planned. And it became effectively a sewer accumulating water without drying throughout summertime. And this has sparked an epidemiological crisis in this particular village because stagnant water in the Amazon and in these disrupted areas becomes also a place where mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and even malaria, which is, of course, not an arbovirus, but falciparum disease, could spread more easily with these change in the landscape. And I think we can also conceive this situation that I'm describing here in the Banana Island as the afterlife of a military development project, because it was in 1979 that the Brazilian military dictatorship decided to build these large continuous irrigated agricultural projects in and around the Banana Island. So it was built through a dual colonial operation, the concentration of indigenous communities, indigenous peoples into restricted areas, together with the conversion of surrounding territories into agribusiness frontiers. And one of the harshest cases here is that of the Avuaca Canoeiro groups that were, it was a forced contact, they were displaced, there was a violent process of territorial cleansing that concentrated them in small plots of land and those that are more affected by flooding, whereas huge areas of this island, of the Banana Island, were transformed into large agrarian enterprise and cooperatives. And the project, of course, depends on these canals, pumps, dams, and drainage systems, and river diversions that redirect water from the Formoso, Javaí, and Araguaia into the irrigated fields. And this is a sum of what I've been describing so far. The indigenous communities, they face floods and droughts. So we call it like a climate of extremes, an environmental of extremes in which floods that already existed in that part of the Amazon have become much more intense. And so thus droughts are also a constitutive part of this movement of the river flooding and retracting. But what we have is an intensification of the hydrological cycle in a way that soils are either too waterlogged or too dry to plant. And the communities are no longer able to produce their own food. And also agribusiness-driven deforestation upstream in the southern states, in the states towards the south, but actually in central Brazil, Goiás and Mato Grosso, they have contributed to so much deforestation that contributes to the drying up of these three rivers that compose the region. So I'm not, of course, me and Avner, we're not the only ones who are working on this situation. There has been a very interesting process involving a popular tribunal that judged that they came to the verdict that there is an ongoing genocide in the Cerrado, because, as I've been explaining, the dynamics of the rivers have been so intensively transformed that traditional agriculture and fishing becomes impossible, unviable. And I'm reaching towards the conclusion. I think that the Banana Island, as elsewhere, it illustrates the main contradictions, perhaps a double contradiction inside climate change and these environmental transformations, which is the communities that are least responsible for climate change are those most exposed to its effects. And at the same time, the vulnerability that they face because of climate change, rising temperatures, and increase in rains and storms, and at the same time in droughts, are intensified by histories of violence, displacement, and infrastructural transformation. I tried to do this kind of like summarization of the ecological challenge, altered hydrological cycle, deforestation, habitat loss, impacts on rivers and soils, disrupted food ecosystems, and this increased exposure to vulnerabilities, mosquito-borne diseases, food insecurity, and displacement and territorial pressure, together with rising temperatures and the change in rainfall patterns that makes the lives of these communities increasingly difficult, since they have to grasp with overlapping crises. And to come back to my main idea, to the topic, to the argument that I want to make about these three cases, is that they are neither fully forest nor urban, but they are shaped by the vulnerabilities of urbanization without having the access to what we would expect could be urban citizenship, such as infrastructures of healthcare and education. They are increasingly exposed to urban forms of vulnerability, growing dependence on industrialized food systems, and heightened exposure to mosquito-borne diseases usually associated with precarious urban environments. And these vulnerabilities emerge from a form, what I've been calling, I don't know if it makes sense, we can discuss that, infrastructure urbanization, in which hydrological disruption, canal construction, river damming, deforestation, standing water, rising temperatures transforms food production and reshape disease ecologies without turning these territories into cities. What I'm aiming to do now in the coming months is to understand how can this fieldwork, how can the reality of these communities contribute to a debate on planetary urbanization. This is a strong debate in urban studies. It's a very strong field with already settled debates, particularly on the possibility of existing and outside of the urban, if there could exist something such as an area that has not been urbanized, has not been influenced by the transformations wrought by the urban development or the urban needs, what the city needs to bring in order to function. And so a huge question in this debate, if I understand correctly, is what counts as urban? And I believe there are perhaps three topics that these cases could add up to this discussion, which is that the communities in and around the Banana Island, they show that the extended urbanization is also a hydrological and epidemiological process that reshapes these communities, as I've been explaining. The second is that the question of whether there is an outside to planetary urbanization, I think, is dislocated. I think it shifts to another question, that is how urbanization processes produce outside as zones of harm absorption. In the sense that I've been explaining, these indigenous communities, they are incorporated to this process without having without becoming the beneficiaries of urban citizenship. And the third element, the third question that I think is interesting is that they do not become a city, but they are marked by overlapping ecologies of vulnerabilities. So these indigenous communities, they remain with the ecological and epidemiological harms, while the benefits and the value generated by these transformations are displaced elsewhere, either to rich farmers in nearby cities in the Amazon or in the Cerrado, or to distant cities, commodity markets in Asia and Europe. So I think those are the 3 points that these cases, in which these cases might contribute to this debate on planetary urbanization. I think there is a distinct form of experiencing this process in which these communities are not by any means becoming cities, but they're not forested communities, they're not rural areas any longer. So that was pretty much it for the presentation, and I'm looking forward to discussing these ideas with you. Please have in mind that this is an ongoing project, and I hope that the discussion might spark also new directions to pursue from here. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Fábio. That's really, really fascinating. And I just wondered if we could open it up for discussion, any comments, questions, and from our online guests as well. Do put your questions in the chat or unmute, and perhaps raise your hand online for your questions and comments as well. Who'd like to kick off? I'll jump in just as a comment, really, that I think it's fascinating situating your work within the literature of planetary urbanisation and planetary urbanism. I think is really fascinating, because there is this blurring of boundaries, I think, between rural and urban, as you've argued really convincingly. I think that there's less and less a distinction between rural communities, rural life, rural ways of living, and the urban. And I think you've made a very strong case there in your work in the Amazon. I think just picking up, you've given lots of different examples of how that's happening, that blurring of boundaries. I think one area that particularly interests me is the role of infrastructure and urban infrastructure, and in particular the ports in this process, particularly related to the Amazon, in terms of the role that infrastructure plays, and what's behind it, what capital's behind it, what business is behind it, and complicity with governments, or local government or national governments, to facilitate the infrastructure, which then benefits governments and business, but far from the communities. So really just a comment on how I think that really sort of, for me, rings very true, and is a critical part of this ecosystem of the urbanisation of the Amazon. So that for me rang very true.
Thank you.
Yeah, would you like to?
Okay. Fábio, well done. Yeah, when I saw the topic as an urban planner, seeing urbanization without cities, I was thinking, how would that be possible? And I was even thinking when I saw that it is in the Amazon region, knowing that the region is popular for the biodiversity of the forest, I was thinking that we'd be talking about the elements of the forest, but in your presentation, I appreciate the explanation and how that infrastructure development is having a negative effect on the local community. But when you are presenting, you talked about environmental impact assessment, that the projects were being carried out, if I got you right, without proper environmental impact assessments. And I know that Amazon region has been popular for long as a place that houses several flora and fauna where the biodiversity is very rich. For the development of such infrastructure in those areas, are there no regulatory bodies put in place to ensure that there will be conduct of environmental impact assessments, or they did it in a cosmetic manner? I mean, just documenting it without implementation. What did you look at that area? If there was a consideration in that pertaining to that, what were your findings?
Thanks. Yeah. Did I convince you that urbanization without cities can?
Yeah, I'm more convinced. I'm more convinced. I have been selling with the.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad I convinced you. No, just joking. Yeah. No, that's a good question. Thank you so much for putting that, because that's at the forefront of the discussions in the Amazon. Every time that we have a different project, a huge project being posed, and some of these infrastructural ports, they are referred by the communities that I visited as monster projects, because the government frames them, and that's the talk I gave at the anthropology department there 3 days ago, because the government frames them as the great projects of the Amazon, and the communities say, wait a minute, they're not great for us. Actually, they're monstrous projects, because their effects, they generate a cascade of effects that keep on happening much after their construction, but much after their building, and that's impossible to foresee, to predict once they are being planned. And of course, that on a lot of the questions about the assessments, environmental assessments, it's very much debated in these communities. I mean, some of them, they just oppose the projects. They don't want the projects to be happening. They want canals to be building. They don't want these dikes, these dams, these huge shipment ports to be built within their territories. And what happens is that we have all sorts of different situations. Sometimes, as you mentioned, the environmental assessment is just cosmetically made to say that there was something that was done. Sometimes they just create a de facto situation in which the canal is built. Now we have to deal with that. The government has little oversight in some parts of the Amazon. It doesn't. It has a hard time understanding what happens, of course, with satellites. That has become much easier to be done. But again, during the years of the Bolsonaro government, there was a dismantlement. There was a huge weakening of the environmental police and environmental governance in the Amazon. So there was an expression that the environmental minister of Bolsonaro, which we could agree it was an anti-environmental minister because he was against all sorts of regulation. And Theo is going to help me with that one. How do you say passar a boiada?
Oh, I am not sure. That's when you allow a lot of bad things to happen, right?
Yeah. Like, since we are already in a situation, let's take advantage and let everything passes at the same time.
Open the floodgates to
Open the
a
floodgates.
lot of, yeah.
In Portuguese, it would literally mean like the boiada is a herd of cattle. So let everything pass. Since we are already have Bolsonaro in government, the Amazon is burning. That's the time for all the cattle to pass. So this canal was built in that in the middle of that situation, that political atmosphere in Brazil. You all remember, right, seeing the media, the environmental impacts of Bolsonaro governments.
And in fact, David has put it.
Okay, great.
You can see on the on the screen at the top there if you want to see.
Oh, changes at the presidential level and impact. Okay, David, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a tricky question. That's a very tricky one. Because on one hand, we could say that there is a continuity between different governments on the right and on the left. Deforestation continues. And actually, the building of some of the most important infrastructure transforming the Amazon was built during our Labor Party, Partido dos Trabalhadores, Lula and Dilma's government. And I'm referring here to one of the biggest hydroelectric dams on the planet, which is Belo Monte. And there are even some critics of the construction, as I am, of Belo Monte, that say that the only way to build such a dam with such an environmental impact on these communities was to have a left-wing government, because they could control the protests. They could avoid the intensity of protests to be happening against the construction of the dam. That's to say, if it were a right-wing government, it would have been more difficult, because the social movements related to the Labor Party would strongly oppose the construction of the dam. So I said it's tricky because at the same time that there is this continuity, there is a huge difference, and the numbers tell us that there is a huge difference in the way deforestation happens during center-left governments and on right-wing and far-right governments in the recent history of Brazilian deforestation since 1988. For instance, now under the second term of Lula government, which is the current president of Brazil, we have a huge reduction in deforestation. And that's mainly because the environmental ministry and environmental police and other regulations were re-implemented, they were reinstalled after Bolsonaro was ousted by popular vote in 2022, thanks. And so at the same time, it's very complicated, because talking about these infrastructures, Julia, that you were mentioning, now, okay, I think it's, well, there is something going on here. Okay, yeah, it's very complicated because also of geopolitics. So, since the first term of President Trump's government in the US, and the geopolitical tensions with China, we have seen China decreasing its exposure to grains imported from the US. The US was the main provider of soybeans to China, to Chinese porks, basically, and chicken. And China has been sourcing its soybeans increasingly from South America, which makes sense. If I were Xi Jinping, I would do the same. I wouldn't be exposed to someone who is saying such strong things about the growth of China. It makes sense to increase dependency on other partners and reduce its exposure to the US. And that has been one of the reasons that has pushed the transformation, the growth in deforestation in the Southern Cone mainly. Brazil is not officially part of the Southern Cone, but it's part of that shared reality. So Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, they have been witnessing a huge transformation in terms of their cultivations, and bigger parts of their territories being dedicated to soy cultivation and exports to China. And at the same time, although Brazil is not part of the One Road Belt Initiative, the New Silk Road, there are immense infrastructural projects being built to connect central Brazil, Bolivia, to export ports on the Pacific coast, mainly in Ecuador, Peru, and northern and southern part of Peru, to make access to Asian markets faster and cheaper. So, and the Brazilian center-left government is very keen on developing these projects whose environmental impacts will be immense, will be astronomical. Yes.
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask about infrastructure, and I guess just not as something that gets built, but also that gets built by particular people and then has to also be maintained and operated by people. I thought that the case of this, ditch that was built to prevent flooding, that required the state government support was quite interesting. Where it's like, okay, this problem, but it wasn't something that then these communities were able to say, okay, let's just fill it in then, or let's change this infrastructure so that it works better. And on the contrast, it feels like the farmers and like agribusiness that are doing this expansion have that ability to create all of this infrastructure, and then also to obviously kind of operate the pumps, whatever kind of fuel or energy is required to do all this pumping or to do the canals. And I guess just thinking with the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia that I'm more familiar with, that's one of these kind of key questions. Is often like farmers will just go in with their diggers and bulldozers and kind of reshape hydrology, put in storage, do all these kind of things. So yeah, I guess the question is like, how is that like capacity to change the hydrology? Who has that power, and like what does it actually require? Is it mostly the state still, or is it also these agri businesses being able to do things kind of on their own initiative?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that question coming from a hydrologist. So I hope the presentation made sense for you. And it's an interesting question. And I think we could debate, whereas there is a long history of state power, statecraft related to who controls water and who is able to build these canals and who is able to transform landscape in such a way. I mean, a long history, because if you think about the proto-urbanizations of ancient Mesopotamia, it was all about who would control the water coming in and water coming out. Roman Empire, etc. I mean, the cases are, and there's an endless list of cases like that. And I think that here is no different. I mean, the communities have very little power. And of course, in this long-term, centuries-old racist structure of Brazilian society, the indigenous communities are not taken in consideration. They just have to live with the burden of development projects. They are. This has changed since democratization. To come back to David's question, I mean, the participation of indigenous communities we have one of the most intense social environmental grassroots movements on the planet. We have people such as Chico Mendes, who you all heard about in the 80s and 90s, one of the most important political figures of Brazilian history. Marina Silva, who is the heir of Chico Mendes, heiress. Yes. Heiress of Chico Mendes. But still, the difference in the power that they have to transform landscape and to resist the landscape is huge. And at the same time, what I think it's interesting in this case is that we often hear in academic debates, in the literature on environmental politics and environmental studies in general, on the importance of community-based solutions. Right, that's one of the, and here we're in front of the limits of community-based solutions, and I find this important to be highlighted. That sometimes academics say, okay, but let's just leave the knowledge, and anthropologists love to do that, or the knowledge of the communities, and they will sort things out. Wait a minute, I mean, you have like hundreds of centuries of transformations, sorry, hundreds of centuries of 500 centuries of transformations in that region, decades of harm being imposed upon these people, and you just want, okay, let's come with a solution coming out from the community. And now what happens is it becomes effectively an open air sewage with water accumulated and the spread of arboviruses. And also, and that's important to say, how this transformation, I tried to show that in the last slide, that's not something I'm working on now, but I envision to work with that in the future. How these huge environmental transformations happening on the ground interact with climate change. Because, and we just saw yesterday the announcement that the El Nino that we were expecting, there was a higher incidence of a higher percent of chance of happening, actually is already here, it's already happening. And we are likely to see a very intense next months of forest fires in the Amazon, and higher temperatures drought also means that when the rain arrives, it will rain a lot, it will be huge storms, and not like, I mean, the climate of extremes is here to stay, and how it interacts with all these landscape transformations already happen on the ground, and particularly in terms of arboviruses spread, dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. That's one of the questions I've been looking at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, I'd love to talk
Yeah.
infrastructure things. If no one else had it, I did have a second question. Or on the concept of, I think what was interesting to me, in its discussions around planetary urbanization, it seemed like, I guess, part of your argument around thinking of these, people living in the areas as being part of a kind of urbanization was around being exposed to disease ecologies that are different to urbanization. I wanted to ask around this idea of urbanization as also being characterized by a kind of urban citizenship. That was, I think, quite a key part of this argument around the kind of tension there is, you're getting the bad of urbanization, but without a kind of concept of what being an urban citizen kind of offers in terms of mobility, health, these kind of things. And I guess it made me think about, like, Nikhil Anand has talked about the concept of hydraulic citizenship as part of what people living in cities in India are always kind of negotiating their political rights around being able to access water and sanitation. So I guess it's a very broad question, but basically just how that kind of idea of citizenship, how that kind of plays a role in thinking about what is and isn't.
Absolutely.
urban.
Yeah. Nikhil Anand's book is very much on my mind every time that I come back to this presentation, to the writings involved in this presentation. So thanks for mentioning his work. And I don't want to sound naive when I talk about urban citizenship. It's very rare to actually have urban citizenship for vulnerable communities in these parts of Brazil. They're often exposed to series of vulnerabilities. But still, I think that the huge contradiction is that somehow you have the worst of the two worlds. And that's what I'm calling like the worst of urbanization, which is this inequalities related to poor neighborhoods in Latin American cities, and the dependence on ultra-processed, industrialized food. Communities that no longer have the ability to grow their own food. And they do not have any kind of healthcare provided by the state. They still need to travel 60 kilometers to go to the city in order to obtain healthcare. They also need to go to the supermarket now, which is still 60 kilometers away. 60 kilometers each way means 120 kilometers. I don't know how much that would be miles. Sorry, I didn't make that.
80, 90.
90 around. So I mean that's the key thing. I mean, at least there is a promise, there is a hope that if you are in the city, the state will somehow have either a hospital, either a health clinic, either a school. I mean, it can be a very bad school, it can be a very bad health clinic, but usually there exists one. There is one, whereas here there are none. That's my point.
I guess I had a very similar kind of question, talking about kind of the definitions that you're using in kind of a very practical way as well as a semantic way, sort of looking at the difference between kind of agro-industrialization and urbanization as kind of fundamental processes, because in some ways it almost feels that even though these hydraulic infrastructures produce a kind of urban periphery, or they're kind of producing almost a transnational urban periphery in the agriculture and the kind of infrastructure that they're trying to create, which is then being shipped off to other urban centers. But these areas themselves are not necessarily, at least I find it difficult to see that they're necessarily undergoing their own form of urbanization, kind of drawing on the kind of earlier discussion that was had about urban citizenship and the idea that urbanization and urban zoned land parcels come with a certain kind of expectation of inhabitancy, where it feels like the kind of corporations or government stakeholders who are fundamentally involved in the transformation of these landscapes, there seems to be no even wish or whim that they would be inhabited. In fact, they're becoming fundamentally uninhabitable through these kind of agrochemical processes. So even though they are very much being forced to participate in the urban, and these communities are being forced to participate in the urban by having to travel their subsistence practices, the land transformation that itself isn't necessarily urbanization. It's more a process of industrialization, or at least, like, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, definitely, it's a form of industrialization, but yeah, but it kind of, yeah, I think that's something I have to think about. I don't have an immediate answer to that. Just it's an interesting point to reflect on. But yeah, I've worked with communities that are very emptied, that are passed through this emptying process, as I mentioned right in the beginning, like the use of agrochemicals make these communities almost disappear in a way. Very sad. It's very melancholic. I mean, you visit these communities, I visit all of them like several times, and then it's like the children's school is no longer. They're not children anymore playing in the school. You go to the church, then the priest is gone. You go to, I mean, you do have this feeling that the community is disappearing, and perhaps urbanization is not the right way of putting it. But I think that the things that are happening here in the Bananal Island are different than this emptying process that I saw. So I'm struggling to find a way to describe that, because I do think that there is a concrete different specialities and environmental process happening in these communities. Perhaps also related to the fact that the impact of hydraulic infrastructure and not the use of chemicals that are forcing them to leave. Nobody would be saying in this context, at least nobody that I heard of, that these communities should just go to the city and find work there. It's just a very slow, violent process of environmental degradation that makes life unsustainable. But I think about if you can call this industrialization, it's a good point. Thanks.
Can I jump in with that with like more concept questions as well? I'm just very curious if you considered like the notion of like sacrifice zones, if you thought about this, because it's, I think you could easily frame like these communities as like sacrifice zones. I think it's in this more like grand, like global process rather than analyze something within like one country. But yeah, just curious if you discarded it deliberately or you want.
No, yeah, I
Because
think,
it's problematic, like it's useful and problematic.
yeah, it's very useful. Yeah, I think it is a sacrifice zone. I think it's no doubt about that. Yeah, but I've been finding more useful to use the term like this by Rob Nixon, this idea of slow violence, like this slow process. And I think it's interesting. I do use sacrifice zone sometimes, although I didn't use in these presentations, but I think that as an anthropologist, for me, what's interesting is both like anthropologists are very interested in the making of things, how things are transformed from A to B. So I'm very interested, and I think that the idea of slow violence allows me to understand that better because they are so dispersed in time. These transformations, they happen through decades. It's very hard to understand them as violent. Although the communities, the narrative coming from the communities help shape these transformations as violence, but they're definitely sacrifice zones.
Come to the end, but I've got just a quick
Yes.
question about methods because I'm really intrigued. You know, as an urban geographer familiar with sort of qualitative methods, yeah, I have worked quite a lot with communities as well, and just the whole issue of being an outsider working in communities and the trust that's needed for that, and how you have gone about sort of negotiating your presence, if you like, within the communities. I'm just interested to hear your experiences.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's very different from my PhD, where I have been going to the same region for 10 years, and this new project, which is something quite new, but usually, and also there is this very particular position that I inhabit, which is now I'm doing less of investigative journalism, but this overlap. I mean, in the field, they also see me as a journalist, and it forces me, it obliges me to present myself with two different hats at the same time. I mean, and sometimes these projects also overlap. This was first published as a piece at The Guardian, as a journalistic piece, a long-form feature, and now for the years it's becoming an academic project. And I think that this also helps to gain the confidence of these communities with huge disparities. I mean, I'm here in Oxford, they're there with suffering the burden of this environmental degradation. So it's important to acknowledge that and to take a lot of care. Also, how do I depict the characters? Sometimes they want their picture to be published because they think that will make them safer in the face of threats coming from agribusiness actors. Sometimes no, sometimes they prefer not to. So there's a long discussion that I very openly engage with members of these communities. What is the better strategy? And sometimes you say, yeah, I want to have my name in international media or being shown in academia, so the farmer next door don't think I'm just anyone who can fret, but I do have international connections. So, but yeah, in general, what I do is that I always present my work to the associations and the community leaders, and there are a lot of NGOs working in different parts of this territory, so they help. And by now, I have, it's not that I'm not known for doing this work, but I have a small reputation of being someone trustful, someone that, you know, is doing a critical work, that, because you have the opposite, you have even anthropologists that go there and say, no, you are just, they interview people, and then they go back to the agribusiness actors and farmers and to politicians related to them and say, no, but they're not even indigenous. And they try, anthropologists in Brazil have done that, have used the discipline and their academic credentials to delegitimize land claims from indigenous communities. So it's tricky. Also, there is an interesting thing that much of the world's attention is concentrated in the Brazilian Amazon, in the Amazon in general, but in the context of Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, and not in the Cerrado. And of course, needless to say, the Cerrado does not exist without the Amazon, and the Amazon does not exist without the Cerrado. Each of the biome depends on the other. The Cerrado, the savanna, is known as the place where most of Amazonian rivers are actually born. All the water concentrates in the Cerrado and then goes. You have rivers that are born from the Andes, from Colombia, Ecuador, and you have the other rivers that are born from the Cerrado. Tapajós is a river of white water that comes from the Cerrado, not with sediments coming from the Andes. So it's very important for the existence of the Amazon. Also, they're interwoven, they're absolutely connected to different biomes. But it's sad that there is very little attention placed to these communities, and they feel abandoned. They feel like nobody cares about that. There are a lot of stories about indigenous communities in the Amazon, and the feeling that they express is that, oh, thank you for coming here, thanks for writing this. Nobody is really looking at us because the focus is somewhere else. Not to say that there shouldn't be a focus in the Amazon, there must be one, but also we must not forget the other biomes.
Yeah, thanks, fascinating. Are there any other questions to wrap up or something online? I think there's the comment online, is that?
Okay, yeah. Thanks for thought-provoking presentation. Urban cities and how the outsides are zones of harm absorption. Joining from Tokyo. You have to leave now, but definitely bring this fossil. Thank you. Appreciate you be.
Great.